Yes, hello everyone. So today I'll be talking a little bit about how to connect your Node.js server with the database. And yeah, why do we need a database? Because we of course need to save things. And you have been working with the database before, so that shouldn't be a challenge. But what can be a challenge in this part is to, as I said, connect the Node.js with the database, and then the way that we interact with the database. So meaning like, how do we make a select statement in Node.js? How do we make a insert selection in Node.js? And that's what I'm going to be covering today. And yeah, so let's get started. I will be following kind of roughly an exercise that is in the Node.js week 3 lesson plan, and it's an exercise where you create like a concerts API. So I won't be doing any of the solutions, but I'll use it as kind of a baseline because it shows a lot of good things. As it says here, setting up the project, let's create an API for concerts. Use the templates found here. So if we go to this link, we can see that in the Node.js week 3 there is an exercise template, which is a Node.js project here. So if you haven't already, when you're going to be working with the exercises, clone it down and then work in this week's folder. I am going to be asking you some questions throughout this video, and please try and answer those questions. So we want to have you move your learning from passive into active learning. Passive is where you're just listening to me kind of going through these things that I'm talking about and showing you some syntax and all that. Active learning is where you're kind of applying what you've learned. So I'll be asking some questions. Please take your time to pause the video, write down the answer, and then wait for me to kind of say the answer and see if it matches up with what you expected. Also take notes throughout this video. It's shown that if you take notes, you more easily remember what I've been talking about. Yes, but this project here I have cloned, and I have opened it as a new project in Visual Studio Code. So here I have like the source backend with the API and the database.index, which is exactly the same as this. Yes. The first thing that we need to talk about is how to handle passwords. And this is very, very, very important. And it's a thing that newcomers within web development, they maybe struggle a little with and sometimes forget, but it's very important. Because how do we store passwords? If I want to log into a database, I need to say, the username and the password in order to log in. So how do we store this? Because if we just stored it directly in the JavaScript files, these files would be committed to Git. And now if you push them online, everyone can see those passwords. And that's a big problem, because then suddenly people can start accessing your data, start deleting your data. So we really, really, really don't want that. So if you're storing any passwords in your GitHub, stop doing it right away and do it the way that I'm talking about now. How we do it is we store the passwords through environment variables, they're called. There is a file called .env.example, and this shows kind of the setup for the environment files. And this file is where you store all kind of sensitive data that you don't want to commit to Git. or it's at least mostly sensitive data. So that means, for example, your host, your password, the name of the database, those kind of things. Okay. So what we do is we store it this way, and the file that we store it in is not called .env.example, but it's called .env. So what you have to do is you have to put in your password here, your username, probably its root, unless you changed it. But of course you have to put in the right password here. Okay. So put in your details, rename this to be called .env. And now Node.js have access to these environment variables, which is your password and those kind of things. So a good question might be, well, Benjamin, you're just creating a .env file. What if you just push that to Git? Then everyone can see it there. Yes, exactly. That's a problem. So how do we kind of counter that? Well, in all Node projects, or at least there should be in all Node projects, there's a .gitignore file, which tells which files and which folders we don't want to commit to Git. One of them is the Node modules folder. It's huge, and we don't want to commit that every time to Git, because that's not the reason we use Git. And it's the same with the .env file. So if we go to the .gitignore file, you can see these are all kind of folders, standard folders and files that we don't want to commit to Git. We should be able to see the Node modules file here, so that won't be committed to Git. And here we see the .env file, .env environment variables file. Okay, we don't want to commit that to Git because that's where all our passwords is going to be stored. Okay, so you need to put in your password, rename this to .env so you don't get your files up into the cloud. I'm not gonna show how this looks because it has my password for the database. So yes, that's it. And I would tell a short story. Like once I was working at a big media company where we were doing kind of analysis on different companies' Facebook posts. The companies that the media company that we were working with was kind of taken care of. And there I accidentally added a password for like some Facebook API login, and it to Git. And it was so bad that Git, they had like, sometimes they have listeners. So they kind of listen for keys in commits. So they saw that I committed that. And like I went home, I didn't even know. And then GitHub literally called the CEO of the company where I was working. And was like, you have to fucking change this. This is a huge problem. And I didn't even know. So the next morning, they were quite angry with me, and that's where I learned a very valuable lesson, which is you don't commit passwords to Git. Okay, it's very important. Yes. So let's take a look at first the file that kind of creates the connection to our database, and it's this one. It's called database.js. So the first thing is we require a .env file. That's so we can use the environment variables that we have stored in here. And how do we use it? We use it like this. We say process.env dot and then the name of the environment variable that we want to get. So if it's dbhost we want, this is like the key, and we'll get this value here. So we use a library called Knex to connect to our database, and Knex kind of handles the way we interact with the database. It makes it a little bit easier for us to write select statements and insert statements. And it can also do some other things that we're going to be using in the final project, but we're not going to be using it for now. So we create Knex and we kind of set it up. This is not super important, but it's just for you to know. And here we check that it's actually working. So if you're seeing this connection to database successful, then you should be happy. Then you have successfully connected to your database. If you don't see this, then there can be a different kinds of problems wrong that I'll be talking about just in a second. The first thing that I want to do with this project is we need to say npm install, so that we install all the dependencies that we have in the package.json. You've done this before. It'll create the node modules folder and add all the different libraries that we need for this project. And you can see Knex is imported here. And that's the reason we can do this. Require Knex. That's because we've installed the dependency. Yes, now we have a node modules folder, and we could even go to here, so Knex. So this is like where all the files are stored for the Knex library. Not that it matters too much. But let's try and say npm run dev and see if this works. Okay, there is an error. It says unknown database concepts. So that's the first thing we need to work with. There is not a database called concepts. If we go to the exercise, it should be here. Then it says here, create a concepts table in MySQL Workbench using the SQL below. Okay, so what Knex was not happy about was that it was saying, but there is no database called concepts. Because if I go to my Workbench here, I can see that there actually is none. So we need to create that. So I paste what was written here into just my Workbench editor, and then I run all of this. And I think if I mark it all and say run, it should work. Now I've created a schema, and I've created a table as well called concepts that have these attributes. So that's the first thing that can go wrong. You haven't created the table that you're trying to select. Sometimes when you press Ctrl C here, at least for me, it doesn't really come. I don't know exactly why. Maybe someone knows and they can tell me. So I just run it again. Yeah, so now I'm getting a connection to the database successful. One or some problems that always kind of persist here is that you write the wrong username, you write the wrong password, the wrong database name. These things you can look up. If you go to the database and click here on Manage Connections, here you will have the host name, here you will have the port, you will have the username, and the password is not stored in clear text because we don't store passwords in clear text here with MySQL Workbench. But hopefully you can remember the password. If not, create a new password and reset it. I'm not entirely sure how to do that, but if you don't see this connection to database successfully, probably it's because that some of this is wrong. Another thing that is very important that you do is that you give it the right database name as well. Okay, and the database name is the schema name. So for us here, it's called concepts. If I was working with this one, it would be calendar. If I was working with this one, it would be meal sharing. Okay. So change this to concepts, change your password, change your username, and these should probably be the same. But as I said, you can check that in the Manage Connections. Okay, now we are all set up. We are happy. We have our Node.js connected to SQL. Now what do we need? Now we need to start actually making queries to the connection. So like doing a select, doing an insert, those kind of things. How do we do that? So as you have seen before, we have a index file where there is a router that takes care of all the connections. And so here we have two routers. One is a router that takes care of all the requests that comes to /API. That's this router here. Then this router uses another router called concerts router, and this router takes care of all the connections that comes to concerts, all the requests that comes to concerts. So that means if I go to localhost :3000/API/concerts, then the router that would take care of all of those requests is the concerts router. Okay, where is the concerts router? It's in the /API/concerts. So we go to /API/concerts here. Okay, so now I have a question for you. How can I get into here? Meaning, there is a function here. This is just an error function. How can I call this function? So take your time and write down, how you should call this function. And I can also say it in another way. If I write console.log2 here, how can I get 2 to be printed out to the console? Saying in other words, like, how do I call this function? Yes, I'll wait 2 seconds.